Hello, sixth graders. It's Mr. Gardell. I hope you're having a superb day. Today's video is going to focus on a few things. One, Chapter 4, or the Ojibwe vocabulary terms, and then me helping you to get started with something called a Venn diagram. Let's start with the terms. Wigwam is simply a round dwelling made out of poles and saplings and covered with sheets of birch bark or woven mats. The difference between really a wigwam from the Ojibwe versus the Dakota's teepee is the wigwam really wasn't portable. It wasn't like a teepee that could be taken down and moved to another location. So a wigwam was more of a permanent home because this structure would take quite a few bit of one's time in order to construct. Birch bark is simply the bark or outer covering of a birch tree. The neat thing about birch bark, it is very, very, very light. Ojibwe would use birch bark canoes to get from point A to point B when traveling on water. The early Dakota, on the other hand, initially used hollowed out log canoes, which was very, very heavy. Migration just simply is the process of moving from one region or country to another. What the Ojibwe did is the Ojibwe migrated from the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of Lake Superior. And there is a map within our online Northern Lights textbook that shows you their migration route. The map is titled Ojibwe Migrations from the East. I would encourage you to take a look at that. Wild rice is simply a tall grass that grows in shallow, still waters and is an edible grain. This typically is harvested late in the summer, early in the fall, and typically grows in northern Minnesota today, but it was a staple grain or a staple food for the early Ojibwe. Maple sugar is just simply a sweet substance made from boiling sap from a maple tree. This typically was done in the springtime, and it was used to obviously sweeten whatever foods that one would eat, in this case, the early Ojibwe. Corn, you all know what corn is, the most important crop or staple grown in the summer for the early Ojibwe. Alliance. An alliance is simply an agreement made between two or more nations or allies to cooperate for a specific reason. And in 1679, the early Dakota and the early Ojibwe formed an alliance. Sovereign. This is an important word, a word that sixth graders in past years have struggled understanding. Sovereign just simply means self-ruling and independent. For example, the Dakota are sovereign from the Ojibwe. They are totally self-ruling and independent from each other. They are not the same. They have their own rules and they're independent from one another. So sovereign just simply means self-ruling and independent. Okay? They are not linked together in terms of what rules and expectations that they follow as a culture or as a tribe. All right. Now let's take a look at the learning activity that you should be completed with for today, and that is your chapter 4 vocabulary. Let's see if I can move this out of the way so you can see. I apologize that this is taking time. I just don't know for sure if you can see this. Oops, let me go back a slide. So what you needed to do on the very bottom, after you defined each of these 8 terms in your own words, was to take the terms, in this case, wigwam and birch bark, and create one complete sentence. Here was my example. The Ojibwe lived in a wigwam made out of birch bark, whereas the Dakota lived in a portable structure called a teepee. Notice that it starts with a capital letter and ends with a period, and notice that I used both wigwam and birch bark within my one sentence and applied it to the early Ojibwe. This isn't about you. I want you to create your sentences as it applies to what you're learning about, and in this case, it's the early Ojibwe. On the second page, wild rice, maple sugar, and corn were our 3 terms. What you needed to do again is to create one complete sentence as it applies in this case to the earlier Ojibwe. Here is my sentence. The Ojibwe harvested wild rice and corn during the late summer, early fall, and made maple sugar during the spring. Let me restate that. The Ojibwe harvested wild rice and corn during the late summer, early fall, and made maple sugar during the spring. Okay, and that is true. That's when they would harvest, the Ojibwe, wild rice and corn, and then they would make their maple sugar in the spring. Migration and seasons. Again, I need to use these 2 terms in one complete sentence. The Ojibwe migrated throughout each of the 4 seasons. One thing you are allowed to do is take a word like migration and change the form of it. So example, I just simply took the word migrate and added an ed at the end and changed migration to migrated. You have every right to do that because you're not changing the meaning of the term. And lastly, sovereign and alliance. This was the most challenging of the two terms. Sovereign is simply, remember, independent or self-ruling. So my sentence is, the sovereign Ojibwe and sovereign Dakota formed an alliance in 1679. If you have questions about your vocabulary, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're going to move forward into our Venn diagram, and I'm going to pull up Schoology right now, and I'm going to click on Friday, February 26th, because this is the day that you're going to be introduced to the Venn diagram. And I apologize again for the delay. It's sometimes slow. So then I'm going to click on Early Dakota and Early Ojibwe Venn diagram. And what should pop up is the opportunity for me to complete this with the Venn diagram. The one thing that I want you to understand about this is this will be a running document. In other words, you will save this and keep adding to it. You won't complete part of it one day and then start new the next day. This is a running document. So let me explain what the direction state for the Venn diagram. Throughout chapter 4, your early Ojibwe learning, complete the Venn diagram which compares and contrasts the early Dakota to the early Ojibwe. Below are some areas to focus on when completing your Venn diagram. You will use this Venn diagram to complete a constructed response and comparing and contrasting the early Dakota to the early Ojibwe. And then it states you do not need to turn in this assessment. That constructed response on comparing and contrasting the early Dakota to the early Ojibwe, we won't begin that until March 8th. So what you're going to do over the next week and a half or so is work on adding as much information to this Venn diagram as possible to help you to use that Venn diagram to construct your response on comparing and contrasting the early Dakota to Ojibwe. So there's some areas to focus on: spoken language, their transportation. I kind of gave you a clue already in this video with the canoes. Their shelter, talked about that already. Food, their values, chores that they had, seasonal activities, like what did they do in the winter, spring, summer, and fall. Human capital, okay, you can focus on that. What skills were they trying to develop so that they could be self-efficient in what they were doing in order to survive? And another thing to focus on is the interactions between both the early Dakota and Ojibwe. So I'm going to open this up with Cami, and I'm not going to necessarily complete anything on here. I just want you to be able to visibly see what this looks like. Most of you have completed a Venn diagram by now at some point in time in your learning between kindergarten and 6th grade. But for those of you who are a little bit still confused as to what a Venn diagram is, this is what it looks like. Okay, so here on the left side we have the Dakota, on the right side we have the Ojibwe, in the middle we have both. So in this column under Dakota, that's basically stating this: how are the Dakota different from the Ojibwe? We go over to the column under Ojibwe, how are the Ojibwe different from the Dakota? And in the middle where it says both, how are they similar? So one thing that I could include right now that I've already addressed for you is their canoe or transportation. So I can type in and I don't even need to say Dakota, used hollowed out log canoes, which were very heavy. And then I can add another one over for the Ojibwe and say used birch bark canoes, just checking to make sure I spelled it right, which were very light. And so really right there what I'm doing is comparing their transportation, in this case their canoes. If you want to get more specific, you can state that as well, but I just wanted you to see how this Venn diagram worked. And once I think of things where what they have in common, like for example they both formed an alliance in 1679, that is something that is similar between them. And what you're going to ultimately do, like I stated already, is keep adding to this every single day for the rest of this week as well as the following week. And then what you'll do is use this Venn diagram to start your constructive response on March 8th. As always, if you have questions, feel free to contact me or your HOA teacher. Take care and have a great day.